It was a stormy night, and I was driving home after my shift at the late-night diner where I worked. The shift was pretty quiet. Even though it was late, I still had this strange energy, so I knew I'd have to take a melatonin pill once I got home to help me sleep. The route I was driving was one I knew well. Beautiful during the day, but incredibly dark at night, with hardly any streetlights. Along the way, there were a few small parking lots, some family-owned stores and restaurants, and then nothing but endless stretches of forest, a blanket of pure darkness. As I passed one of the parking lots of a well-known diner, I noticed a woman standing under a streetlight, drenched in the pouring rain, waving me down. I slowed my car and saw that she was an older woman, probably in her 50s. She was tall, around 6 feet, but very thin. I rolled down my window and called out, "Do you need a ride?" She walked over, opened the door, and thanked me repeatedly, calling me a hero. I asked where she needed to go, and she said just a short distance to the nearby town. She was soaked, and her wet clothes were getting my seat wet too. But I always consider myself a kind person, and I couldn't leave her out in the cold rain. If it had been a man, though, I might have thought twice. The woman seemed friendly enough, but as we talked, I noticed she was missing a few teeth, which made me a bit uncomfortable. I started wondering if she might be homeless. She didn't smell bad or look disheveled like someone living on the streets might, but maybe the rain had masked any unpleasant odors. Her hair was soaked, and I thought that normally it might be frizzy and unkempt, but the rain had made it flat. Still, she smiled the whole time and didn't seem like a threat. We drove up to an intersection where there was a gas station on the corner. I pulled up to a pump, deciding to fill up while I was there. I asked if she wanted anything from inside. I figured I'd do my good deed for the week. She politely declined, saying, "No, thank you, sweetheart." So I went inside, paid for the gas, and grabbed an energy seltzer for the weekend. When I returned to the car, she was gone. I looked around the small gas station parking lot, but there was no sign of her. She must have taken off somewhere. I felt a little guilty, like she was a lost, hopeless woman, but part of me was relieved. I filled up my tank and headed home. When I got home, I walked straight into my apartment, which was on the ground floor of a 2-story house. There was another tenant living upstairs, but I had the lower level. The main door that led into the hallway was usually left open, and then each apartment had its own locked door. I stepped inside, glad to be out of the rain, and placed my seltzer on the kitchen counter. It was late, but I wasn't too tired, so I took a melatonin and tried to sleep. Despite the melatonin, I couldn't fall asleep right away. My mind kept racing, thoughts of the woman I had picked up, wondering what had happened to her. Every now and then I heard faint noises outside my bedroom, but I dismissed them, thinking it was the tenant upstairs. If only I had been more careful before going to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, in total darkness, which never happens when I take melatonin. Usually, I sleep through the night. I sat up, still groggy and thirsty. As I reached for the glass of water on my nightstand, I heard something and saw movement in the corner of the room. Someone was crouching behind my wardrobe, legs bent. I told myself it was just my imagination. I shook my head vigorously and made some weird noises, even slapped myself in the face. Then, the figure stood up and walked out of the room. I didn't scream. I didn't say a word. I just sat there in shock. What troubled me the most was that after the figure left, I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no doors opening or closing. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He answered, confused as to why I was calling so late. I told him what I had just seen, and he said, "Trish, you must have had a nightmare." I stayed on the phone with my dad, gradually feeling more awake, as I left my bedroom and turned on the lights in the living room. It was a small space. No one was there. I checked the entire apartment and confirmed that no one had broken in. I began to convince myself it had all been a dream, but I still locked my bedroom door before going back to sleep that night. The next morning, I had a cup of coffee and got ready for the gym. When I opened my door to the hallway, I realized the main door was already open. My heart sank. Could what I saw last night have been real? I checked the apartment again, finding nothing out of place. As I headed to my car and opened the back door to throw in my gym bag, I noticed damp, yellow-brown stains on the floor in the back seat. The blanket I always kept there was gone. I wanted to scream or cry. It hit me while I was inside the gas station. That woman must have slipped into my back seat. Somehow, she got into my apartment, or maybe I had forgotten to lock the door. Panicked, I called my dad again, asking what I should do. He told me to check if anything was missing, and if not, there wasn't much point in calling the police. I searched my apartment thoroughly and found nothing out of place except for the missing blanket from my car. I skipped the gym that day. In fact, I stayed in my apartment for a while after that. I was genuinely shaken. I didn't want to stay there any longer, and by the end of the month, I had moved out. This happened a few months ago, and I'm still not sure why I agreed, but I decided to go with John, my friend, to a house party he was invited to during our freshman year of high school, even though I hadn't been invited. Somehow, John convinced the host to let me come, and I accepted, knowing I wouldn't be able to drive myself there. So I decided to go with him. When we got to the party late at night, John suggested that I leave my phone in the car. He explained that I might lose it, or someone could try to take it when I wasn't paying attention. I was confused at first, but eventually I just nodded and we stepped out of the car. John and I made our way to the backyard of the house where the party was in full swing. Looking around, I noticed people doing various things: smoking, drinking, and possibly using other substances in small groups. John encouraged me to go meet some people and introduce myself. After a few hours, I realized I had drunk too much, as my vision had started to blur. I stumbled toward the house and had to lean against a wall to keep myself steady. Glancing at my watch, I saw that it was almost midnight, or maybe even 1 a.m. I knew it was time to leave, so I started searching for John. Even though I was exhausted, I tried scanning the backyard, but I couldn't find him. I asked a few people if they'd seen John, but everyone said no. I decided to call him and ask where he was, but when I reached into my pocket for my phone, I remembered that it wasn't there. I cursed myself for leaving it in John's car, and now he had disappeared along with it. I realized the only way to get home was to walk, as I recalled my house wasn't too far from the party. But tonight was cold, being in the fall. I thought about asking someone for a ride, but no one seemed to be willing to help. So I made up my mind to walk home through the dark. I stepped onto the road and began stumbling along the quiet street. I knew I had drunk too much because I felt dizzy and lightheaded. After a few minutes, I made it to the main road and kept walking. My mind was filled with thoughts, like why John had left me alone at the party, or why I had foolishly followed his suggestion to leave my phone in the car, only to now be unable to call him or anyone else. I mentally scolded myself for not being more careful with how much I drank, knowing I shouldn't have let it get that far. I paused on the roadside because I felt too tired and crossed my arms to stay warm. Then I remembered I could try hitchhiking. I stuck my thumb out, hoping someone would see me and stop. I watched as a few cars drove past, but no one slowed down. As time went on, I began to worry, thinking I might have to continue walking home after all. It was already past 1 a.m., and only a few cars passed by without stopping. Maybe they didn't see me, or maybe they just didn't care. I hesitated, thinking about continuing to walk, but I knew in my drunken state that would be exhausting. I kept my thumb out when finally, a gray truck pulled up in front of me. Smiling, I stumbled toward the vehicle. The window rolled down, and an older man with a beard asked if I needed a ride. I said yes and gave him my address before getting in, feeling grateful for the ride. As we started driving, the man tried to make conversation, asking what had happened, but I was too drunk to properly respond. Everything I said came out as slurred mumbling. When we turned onto my street, a sense of unease crept over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about this man. Suddenly, we passed my house. I told him that we had just gone by it, and my gut instinct was screaming for me to get out of the car immediately, but I was too drunk to act on it. As I was about to ask him to stop, he turned to me with a menacing look in his eyes. "You know, you really shouldn't drink so much when you're hitchhiking. It makes you an easy target," he said, his lips curling into a creepy smile. He reached over and started touching my leg, and I didn't know what he planned to do next, but I was sure it wasn't good. Before he could do anything else, we both heard a police siren wail behind us, and red and blue lights lit up the night. Relief washed over me as I realized it was the police. The man panicked, stopped the car, and unlocked the doors, allowing me to quickly jump out. I ran toward the police officer, who hurried over to me. I told him the whole story about what had just happened. Unfortunately, the man hadn't broken any clear laws at that point, and the officer explained they were looking for a gray truck, suspected of stealing something from a store. I wasn't sure if the man who had picked me up was the one they were looking for, but I felt incredibly lucky that the police had stopped us. The officer gave me a ride home, and from that night on, I promised myself I would never drink to the point where I couldn't think clearly again. Now, I understand the importance of being responsible and staying aware of my surroundings, even when I'm just trying to have fun. This happened when I was still in college. I attended a large university in upstate New York, known for its wild parties. Even though I wasn't part of any sorority, I often went to parties hosted by fraternities. I went through a phase of heavy drinking during my time in college, but fortunately, I've moved past that phase now. One evening, there was a big fraternity party, and my friends, Susie and Mia, were eager to attend. I'm not usually the type to turn down a party unless I'm already too drunk. In fact, even when I've had a bit too much to drink, I often try to join in anyway. At that time, I was living with 3 other girls in a rented house off campus. We weren't part of any particular group, just 4 friends sharing a place. I remember that the party was being hosted by Kappa Sigma, about a 20-minute drive from campus. Before heading to the party, we had a pretty heavy pre-game at our house, drinking a bit before calling an Uber and splitting the fare. On the way there, we kept drinking a few more rounds, definitely a recipe for disaster. By the time we arrived, I was already pretty out of it. My memory of the house where the party was held is fuzzy because it was my first time at a Kappa Sigma party. I vaguely recall a few scenes: a group of guys standing at the entrance, a DJ playing music in the living room, and 2 beer pong tables set up in the kitchen. After that, I don't remember anything else. The next thing I knew, I woke up lying on the grass by the side of a road. My head was pounding like someone had hit it with a hammer, and I still felt the effects of the alcohol. The night was pitch black, and I was lying next to a forest. In the distance, I could see a few streetlights, but the area where I was lying wasn't completely dark. I instinctively checked my pockets and began to panic when I realized my phone was gone. My bag was also missing. I didn't have anything with me. At that moment, I was terrified, unable to call for help or even check the time. I looked around but saw nothing. My white shirt was covered in dirt, but that was the least of my concerns at that point. I stood up and started walking toward the streetlights. As I got closer, I realized there weren't any houses in sight. I was in a completely unfamiliar place. I leaned against a streetlight, unsure of what to do. Eventually, I decided to wait and see if anyone drove by so I could ask for help. It took about 15 minutes before I finally saw headlights approaching from a distance. I stepped out onto the road, waving my arms and jumping up to make sure they saw me. The car slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. I walked up to the car, and the driver rolled down the window. It was a man who asked if I was okay. I told him I was lost and needed a ride home. He told me to hop in, and I thanked him for the ride. As we drove, he asked me what had happened, and I explained that I'd been at a party, and the last thing I remembered was waking up by the side of the road. Looking back, I realize I shouldn't have been so open about my situation. I should have given a more vague answer instead of revealing that I was drunk and vulnerable. He then asked why I hadn't called someone for help, and I explained that I'd lost my phone. At this point, the man gave me a strange look, and I started to feel uneasy. We continued driving down a deserted road, and after about 20 minutes, I began to sense that something wasn't right. I asked him how much further we had to go, but he didn't answer immediately. I had to ask again, and this time he replied, "Not too far now. in a soft voice. I felt a growing sense of dread. My house should have been in a residential area, but we were still on a dark road surrounded by trees. I noticed him glancing at me occasionally, and fear started to build up inside me. I asked if he was sure he had the right address, and he said yes. Then, out of nowhere, he turned to me with a disturbing question. "What color underwear are you wearing?" and started rubbing my knee. I immediately pushed his hand away, begging him not to hurt me. He responded with a sinister smile, "Why would I hurt you?" But then, he pulled over to the side of the road and stopped the car. It looked like he was about to make a move toward me, but I didn't give him the chance. I quickly opened the car door and ran into the woods. Luckily, I was wearing sneakers, so running through the forest wasn't too difficult. When I could no longer see the car's lights, I heard him shouting, "Where are you? I just want to have some fun." I covered my mouth to keep from making any noise. After a while, I heard the car door slam shut, and he drove off. I waited a bit longer before heading back to the road. I felt completely helpless. I didn't want to see that man again, but I also needed help from someone else. I stood at the edge of the road, waiting for another car to come by. Eventually, another car appeared. I saw the headlights from afar and waited until I was sure it was a different car before stepping out and waving for help. The car stopped, and this time, it was an older man. I sat in the back seat, too shaken to say much. I only answered his questions about my situation briefly. Thankfully, he drove me home safely. By the time I got back, it was nearly 4 a.m. My friends had been waiting for me. They had my phone and bag. They even considered calling the police if I didn't return by morning. No one could figure out who I had been with or why I ended up passed out by the side of the road. The guy I had been with at the party swore he hadn't left with me. In fact, there was no clear evidence of who I had left with, but it still didn't explain why I woke up where I did. After that night, I drastically cut back on drinking. I never want to find myself in such a dangerous situation again. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, let me know where you're tuning in from. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of the upcoming scary stories. We appreciate your support. Feel free to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. This story happened when I was still in college. I was hitchhiking from Leipzig, Germany, to Paris, and the driver was a disheveled French man. He was short, thin, unshaven, and generally scruffy. Even so, he agreed to give me a ride to Paris, where I needed to go to collect some paintings from an exhibition. It was October at the time. I was 29 years old, and he seemed about the same age. His English was broken, and I didn't know any French. In fact, I knew nothing about this man. That day, the weather was pleasant, sunny, and the sky was clear. It was a perfect day to hitch a ride. I met him at a gas station around 4:30 p.m. and eagerly hopped into his old, beat-up car. I felt relieved that I had finally found someone willing to give me a lift. We drove along the main road heading to Paris. After some small talk, mostly about where I was headed, he suddenly reached across me, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out a stack of passports. He showed me 4 different passports. The first was from his girlfriend who had died after falling off his motorcycle. The second belonged to another girlfriend who had died in a car accident. The third died of a brain tumor, and the fourth fell off a horse. He said, "I'm really unlucky." I just nodded, thinking to myself that he truly was unfortunate. From that moment, I started to feel uneasy, and the unsettling feeling grew as I thought about the passports of these young women that he carried around. Shortly after showing me the passports, the man mentioned that he wanted to take a shortcut to Paris. He didn't ask, he just stated it, and I was too eager to reach my destination, so I agreed. I thought we would pass through some charming French villages, but that didn't happen. Instead, he turned onto a narrow, remote dirt road. At that moment, I thought, something isn't right. But I remained silent. Why do we always stay quiet in situations like these? Perhaps because we don't want to cause trouble. The road grew narrower as we entered the dense forest. The sun was setting and the sky was gradually darkening, engulfing the forest. I started to worry. This was the perfect place to hide something sinister. Yet I still didn't say anything. Suddenly, the man shouted, I don't want to speak English anymore. It wasn't a suggestion, it felt like an order. From then on, the rest of the trip was filled with an awkward silence. The deeper we drove into the forest, the more anxious I became. The man looked tense, muttering things in French that I couldn't understand. I gripped the car door handle, ready for the worst. The car began to slow down, and I panicked, thinking this might be the moment he planned to kill me. Did he have a gun? Was he going to murder me right there? But then, all of a sudden, he sped up again. I exhaled in relief. We emerged from the forest and got back onto the main road. When we stopped, he asked if I wanted to stay at his place for the night and suggested we could have dinner together. I politely declined. Eventually, he drove off, and I stood there watching until his car disappeared from view. I didn't report him to the police because I didn't speak French, and I convinced myself that maybe my imagination had gotten the better of me. I yelled something out into the night sky, wondering what on earth had just happened. That night, I felt completely drained and ended up falling asleep right on the side of the highway. The next morning, I woke up still in disbelief about the previous day. I looked at my hands and asked myself, am I still alive? Fast forward 20 years later, I was teaching English to a German business student at a cafe in Leipzig. For some reason, we started talking about hitchhiking, and I shared my story. Immediately, my student pulled out his smartphone and searched for information about French serial killers. He showed me some photos. It was him. The man in the photos was Patrice Alleg, a notorious serial killer. He was the man who had given me that strange ride so many years ago. I would never forget that face. In the 1990s, there had been reports of a serial killer targeting young women along roads and highways in France. I had heard about him back then, but never imagined I had come so close to death. After that night, I often wondered if the women he murdered might have been buried in the forest we passed through. I wish I had gone to the police. Even though he's now in prison, I feel guilty, thinking that maybe I could have helped prevent more murders. Ever since then, I've carried a heavy feeling inside, like a shadow weighing down on my soul. Perhaps the spirits of those women escaped with me, yearning to leave that dark forest behind. This story was told to me many times when I was a kid by an older family friend named Lucy. It was like one of those life lessons that you're constantly reminded of, and honestly, I've never forgotten it. Anytime someone mentions hitchhiking, this story immediately comes to mind, and I think it always will. In fact, whenever I think about it, I still get a bit queasy. Lucy, who grew up around the same time as my dad, so this must have happened in the early 80s, was a young woman in her 20s at the time. She had a truly kind heart, always willing to help anyone in need, and I can't imagine her being any different when she was younger. That's why I totally believe she did what she did. One day, on a drive into the city, a trip that took about 2 hours from her town, Lucy spotted a man walking along the side of the road. As she got closer, he turned around and, in typical hitchhiker fashion, stuck out his arm with his thumb up. With her usual kindness, Lucy stopped and asked if he needed help. She told me that the man was very polite, though a bit shy when he asked if she could give him a ride into the city. Lucy smiled and opened the passenger door for him. He tossed his bag into the back seat and buckled up for the journey. Throughout the trip, they had a pleasant conversation about friends, news, and just everyday things. Lucy felt like they were getting along well, and she even bought him dinner at a rest stop about halfway there. She said he seemed embarrassed and awkward when she paid, but after he shared that he was having financial difficulties, which was why he was hitchhiking in the first place, he eventually agreed to let her pay. After that, they continued on their way. Once they reached the city, the man thanked Lucy profusely for both the ride and the meal. He asked to be dropped off downtown. Before getting out of the car, he asked for her phone number so he could contact her sometime and maybe meet up again. Thrilled at the idea of hearing from her new friend, Lucy gave him her number and drove off, feeling good about having helped someone. Now, I'm sorry if you were expecting something creepy to have happened, but I think what scared me the most as a kid was how smoothly everything seemed to go. Lucy had this wrinkle on her forehead and a strange look in her eyes as she told me what happened next. A week later, she got a call from the man she had picked up. He didn't let her get a word in after hello, and immediately told her she should thank God for being raised so well. Because when he first got into the car, his plan was to rape and kill her. After they reached the rest stop, he was going to steal her car, dump her body in a ditch down the road, and move on with his life. But after she treated him so kindly and even bought him dinner with a smile on her face, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He said he wouldn't have been able to live with himself after doing that to such a nice person. His final words on the phone were, "Please, Lucy, never pick up another hitchhiker." Then he hung up. Lucy never heard from him again. When she tried calling the number back, all she got was the dial tone of a payphone. And from that story, I learned one very important thing. I'm going to take that man's advice and never, ever pick up a hitchhiker. The wrong hitchhiker. From my one and only experience picking up a hitchhiker, I've learned one thing. Never pick up a hitchhiker. It was a Saturday night, around 1 a.m. I was driving on Route 542 in New Jersey, the road I usually took to get to town. It's a long stretch, flanked by woods on either side, with the occasional house here and there. I was heading back home after a trip to town, and like usual at that hour, there wasn't another car in sight. I turned on the high beams of my Jeep to get a clearer view on the unlit road, and thanks to that, I spotted a person standing far off on the shoulder. As I got closer, I saw the man raise his arm and stick out his thumb, signaling for a ride. My heart began to race. I wasn't sure if I should stop. I slowed down to get a better look at the guy. He looked like a young man, maybe around 28 years old. He was wearing a light gray hoodie with the hood up and blue jeans. The decision had to be made in an instant, and in the heat of the moment, I decided to stop, rolled down the window, and asked, "Where are you heading?" "Just a bit up the road," he replied in a low, quiet voice. "I'll give you a ride," I responded through the window. He opened the door of my Jeep and got in slowly. Jeep Wranglers have tight-fitting doors, so when he tried to close it the first time, it didn't shut completely. I politely said, "The door didn't close all the way. You have to open it and slam it hard. These doors are tough to shut." His body language was unsettling. About 3 seconds after I spoke, he turned to look at me, then slowly turned his head to the right, waiting a few more seconds before finally opening the door and slamming it shut. The way he moved already made me regret letting him in. I hit the gas and we started moving. The speed limit on that road was 55 miles per hour, but I was doing 75 just to get him where he needed to go faster. "So, how far did you say you were going?" I asked again. After an awkward pause, he finally said, "Just a few miles." I wanted to turn on the radio to break the eerie silence, but something inside told me not to, for reasons I couldn't explain. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed he had turned his head and was staring directly at me. At that point, I knew I needed to get him out of my car. For a full mile, I felt his gaze boring into me, and I did everything I could to avoid looking back. Finally, he turned his head the other way and said, "You know, I've been thinking for a long time about whether it's worth it to end everything." I turned to look at him, confused. He reached into his pocket and said, "I've been carrying this knife with me for the past few weeks, just waiting for the right time." He pulled out a large, red knife from his pocket, and at that moment, it felt like my stomach dropped out of my body. I told him to put the knife away immediately. He replied calmly, in an emotionless voice, "Pull over next to that sign." I did what he said, and stopped the car beside a speed limit sign. What happened next still haunts me. He started cutting into his forearm, right next to 3 scars that seemed like previous self-inflicted wounds, and let out a disturbing moan. I choked out, "You need to get out of my car right now." He looked at me and said, "Get out of the car. I want to show you something." I refused, and he raised the knife closer to me in a clear threat. "Just get out for a second. There's something I want to show you behind that sign." I knew my life was on the line and I had to think fast. I said, "Yeah, all right, man, let's go." I opened the door, deliberately leaving it wide open, raised my hands in the air, and slowly backed away from the car. He also got out and started walking around toward my side. The second he was directly behind the car, I jumped back in, threw the car into gear, and sped off, never looking back. I got home within 10 minutes, still gasping for breath and feeling like I was going to throw up. This was the scariest experience of my life, and I urge anyone and everyone, if you ever see a hitchhiker on a deserted road at night, don't do anything other than drive right past them. Three months after I turned 16 in 2005, I got my first car, a 1999 Toyota Camry. One warm Saturday evening, my friend Tommy invited me to a big party at one of his friends' houses. Knowing that I wouldn't be in any condition to drive home afterward, we decided to carpool with Tommy's girlfriend, Brianna. We lived in rural Virginia, where big parties weren't common, so when one did happen, it was a big deal, and everyone showed up. The house was only about 5 to 10 minutes away from us. I knew the guy hosting the party, but we weren't particularly close. On the way there, we drove along a 2-lane road through the woods, with the house further down the road. In some sections, there were houses on either side, but for the most part, it was just an empty, long road. The house was small, like many around the area, but the party was held outside because the neighbors were far enough away that no one would complain about the noise. I'll skip most of the party details, but at one point, Brianna, who was supposed to be our designated driver, had to leave suddenly due to a family issue. Tommy said it wasn't a big deal, and we'd figure out a way to get home. A few hours later, after a few too many drinks, I could barely walk straight. I looked at my watch. It was already 2 a.m. I decided it was time to leave. I started searching for Tommy but couldn't find him anywhere. In fact, it seemed like everyone I knew had already left. My head was spinning, but I was still furious that Tommy might have left without telling me. I borrowed the host's phone and called Tommy's house. After trying twice, I gave up, realizing it was too late to wake up his family. Not knowing what else to do, I stepped out onto the road and began walking home. Despite feeling dizzy, I knew the walk would take at least half an hour in my condition. After about 15 minutes of walking, I saw the headlights of a car approaching from behind. Relieved, I stuck out my thumb, hoping to hitch a ride. The car slowed down and pulled up next to me. The driver of a '98 Ford Explorer rolled down his window and asked, "Where are you heading?" I slurred my words, telling him that my house was just up the road and to the right. He chuckled and told me to hop in. I gratefully climbed into the car, feeling exhausted. I barely paid attention to what he was saying because I was so close to passing out, and eventually, I did. The next thing I remember is waking up in the moving car. The man glanced at me and laughed, but didn't say anything. I looked around and realized that the road we were on didn't seem familiar. I nervously asked, "Where are we going?" Instead of answering, he asked, "Why were you out so late?" As he dodged my straightforward question, the reality of the situation hit me. "I think you can drop me off anywhere," I stammered. He coldly replied, "No." Hearing that, I felt a wave of nausea. I really thought I was about to throw up. I started gagging, feeling sicker by the second. The man glanced at me, and that's when I saw my chance. I leaned toward him, pretending to vomit, which made him recoil and slow the car down. Thankfully, because I had drunk so much, I actually did throw up, all over his lap. He yelled in frustration and slammed on the brakes. That's when I bolted from the car, running into the woods and ducking behind some bushes. The man got out, flashlight in hand, and began searching for me. Twice, his light passed right over me, but he didn't see me. Eventually, I heard his footsteps grow fainter as he moved deeper into the woods. That was my cue. I sprinted back to his car, but unfortunately, he had locked it. By some stroke of luck, I saw another car approaching from a distance. I ran out into the road, waving my arms like a madman. The driver tried to avoid me, but I didn't let them. They had no choice but to stop, and I frantically yelled for help before the guy came back. After explaining that I had been kidnapped by the man driving the Ford Explorer, The driver agreed to take me home. Not to the police, but straight to my house. I made it back safely and couldn't stop thanking the driver. I immediately woke my parents and told them everything. My dad asked if I had gotten the guy's license plate number, and at that moment, I wanted to punch myself. I hadn't thought to get the most basic information that would help track the guy down. All I knew was that he was driving a faded blue '99 Ford Explorer. I made sure to give Tommy a piece of my mind afterward, and a part of me has always held a grudge against him for leaving me at that party without saying anything. It's been 4 years since I last saw Tommy, and this is actually the first time I've thought about that night in nearly a year. Time has a way of making even the worst memories fade. But after writing this story to share online, everything feels fresh in my mind again. This story is told by a woman named Sarah. Back in 1985, when I was 17 years old, I was the youngest in my graduating class and spent the entire summer exploring nearby colleges. There was no internet back then, so if you wanted to attend a college in another state without much money or connections, you had to make a long trip yourself. I was born in Seattle, but by that time, my family had moved to Mount Shasta, a small town in Northern California. I couldn't start school with my friends because I had to stay home to care for my mother. Toward the end of that summer, my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and my father worked 10-hour days to cover the bills. For the next year, I took care of my mother while my father kept working. Fortunately, my mom didn't have to suffer long because the cancer was too advanced when it was discovered. She passed away in the fall of that year. After her passing, my father was determined to help me start college as soon as possible. He always felt guilty for keeping me home, but I never resented him for it. Eventually, I decided to return to Seattle for college. My dad gave me $500 and the keys to his old Chevrolet pickup truck, telling me that once I got there, he'd send money to help me rent an apartment and get settled in the big city before school started. He wanted to make sure nothing would stand in the way of my education. One fall afternoon, I set off heading north. The trip should have been straightforward, just a straight drive along Interstate 5 from Mount Shasta to Seattle. But somewhere in Oregon, my truck broke down. A coolant hose was leaking, and I couldn't fix it on the spot. So I started walking toward the nearest town. I had just passed a small town called Greene and was south of a larger town called Roseburg. I wasn't sure how far I was from Roseburg, but I thought I could walk there and find a repair shop. As night began to fall, the cold started to bite, making the walk miserable. I decided to try hitchhiking, but after walking for quite some time, no one stopped to help. Finally, a big red truck pulled over in front of me. The driver, a friendly-looking man, introduced himself as Rick and offered me a ride. When I told him my truck had broken down and I needed to get to Roseburg to call for a tow, he said there wouldn't be any repair shops open at that hour. He suggested dropping me off at a motel where I could stay overnight and call for a tow in the morning. On the way, we chatted about various things, from the weather to sports. Rick unexpectedly complimented my looks, though the way he said it didn't make me feel too uncomfortable. But then, the atmosphere in the truck turned strange as Rick suddenly fell silent. Looking around the cabin, I noticed there were some children's clothes and shoes in the back. Rick explained that his daughter had been with him on a recent trip, but when I asked more about her, he hesitated, which made me start to feel uneasy. A sense of danger began to creep over me. We were approaching Roseburg, but I still hadn't seen any motels. When I asked about it, Rick dodged the question and kept driving north. I began to feel anxious and knew I had to get out of the situation. I grabbed my backpack and asked him to stop so I could use the restroom. But instead of stopping, Rick looked at me with a chilling expression and called me Jenny, a name that wasn't mine. Sensing the danger, I knew I had to act. When the truck slowed down, I opened the door and jumped out, rolling onto the grass by the side of the road. Though bruised from the fall, I quickly got up and ran toward town. Luckily, I found a house and begged for help. The homeowners called the police, and they immediately began investigating. Though they didn't catch Rick that night, the story didn't end there. The police patrolled the highway throughout the night, searching for any sign of the red truck, but they found nothing. It was difficult to track down a man who had only appeared briefly on a lonely stretch of road at night. Sarah was taken to the local police station, where she provided a detailed account of Rick and his truck. The officers listened carefully and occasionally called other areas to check if there had been any similar incidents. Strangely, Rick didn't seem to be a local, as no one in the area had seen or heard of a man matching his description. Sarah's suspicions about him only deepened. Over the following weeks, the police chief stayed in touch with Sarah, occasionally sending her photos of suspects they'd apprehended or truck drivers who matched Rick's description, but none of them were the man Sarah had met. She started to wonder if Rick was a drifter, with no fixed schedule or route, making him hard to track. Sarah's anxiety about the children's shoes and clothes in Rick's cabin stayed with her. She couldn't stop thinking about how the shoes were different sizes, as if they belonged to two different little girls. Could Rick have harmed those children? The unanswered questions continued to haunt Sarah. She felt a sense of invisible dread, as though Rick was still out there somewhere, and that he might continue to bring pain to others.